In this module, we're going to take a look at the labor-supply relationship, or the supply of labor, and we'll do so by taking a look at the labor force participation, a brief review of what we already considered in one of the earlier modules in this course. We'll look at the labor-leisure relationship. We'll consider the effect of incomes and substitutes. We'll think about budget and utility, much like we would for a consumer optimization relationship. And we'll think about what motivates the decision to work or not, and then we'll think about changes in that decision over time as they affect individuals. First, we'll take a look at the labor force participation rate and participation generally. As we do that, we'll take a look at the rate itself. We'll consider changes in the labor force participation rate. We'll talk about the reservation wage. We'll think about opportunity costs with respect to labor. We'll look at an unusually shaped labor supply curve, and then we'll talk about the presence of stabilizers in the marketplace. First, let's look at the labor force participation rate. You'll recall from our earlier module on the labor market that the labor force participation rate is the labor force divided by the population age 65. And you should recall that the labor force itself, labor force, is equal to the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. We remember then that the unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. The employment rate is equal to the number employed divided by the labor force, again times 100. And the labor force participation rate is the labor force divided by the working age population, which we commonly think of as the population ages 16 to 65, again times 100, and that's going to give us the labor force participation rate. When we think about the labor force, what we're really thinking about is labor supply. So the labor force at any time is going to equal our labor supply at any time. And so whatever motivates changes in the labor force is also motivating changes in labor supply. We'll recall from our earlier module this labor force participation graphic that we brought up. The changes here aren't quite as significant as they appear, because recall that we're beginning at 58% of the population, or 58% of the working age population, and we end at 68% of the working age population. So we're really not looking at a 0 to 100 scale, so that kind of exaggerates the effect of these changes. But as we see changes in this labor force participation trend line, what we're really seeing is changes in labor supply. So here we saw the labor supply dramatically increased from about 1962, 1963, all the way up to 1999, just before the year 2000. We see certain changes in the labor supply during recessions. We see that since 1999 or 2000, the labor supply has dramatically decreased, and this is in terms of the percentages of the working age population, which may or may not have a relationship with the actual number in the labor supply. But given that our population is increasing, and certainly our adult population is increasing, then we would say that during these periods of time, these would also be not only in changes by percentage, but also changes in actual numbers. So remember that we saw an increase in two-income households in this period from 1963 to 1999-2000. We've continued to see an increase in two-income households, of course, even since 2000, but we've seen a decrease in the labor supply, or a decrease in the labor force participation in this case, and that's because of a number of factors we talked about earlier, which may include early retirement, discouraged workers, as we've had a couple of fairly significant recessions here, etc. Well, let's think about then the concept of reservation wage and opportunity cost. We may have referenced this in an earlier module, but if we look at our basic labor market model here with wages and labor on the y and x axis, and an upward sloping labor supply curve, we have to think about what we're being told right here, where this supply curve transects the y axis. Here we see that at a wage of 10, there are 0 workers that present themselves to the market. That would suggest that in this market, the reservation wage has a relationship to this $10 value. In fact, the reservation wage must be greater than $10. At $10, no one will work. But at something above $10, $10.50, $11, etc., then we have some positive number of workers that are willing to present themselves in the labor supply relationship. So the reservation wage is this wage at or below which workers will not present themselves as part of the labor supply, which must mean that they have some other opportunities to spend their time with, or there's some other value that they get from spending their time doing other things. So if I'm not employed and I see that there are jobs at $10 an hour and I continue to not be employed, that's suggesting to me that I have an opportunity cost of more than $10 per hour. So now we're talking about opportunity cost, of course. So, and I have an opportunity cost in this case of at least $10 an hour. So my opportunity cost and my reservation wage might have a relationship with one another. So what's the opportunity cost that we're talking about here? Well, think about it. If you give up an hour of labor, so 1 hour of labor, the opportunity cost is 1 hour of leisure. Well, how do I value that opportunity cost of 1 hour of labor? Well, I know I could be out playing, I could be sleeping, I could be with family, I could do something else, but it's a little bit difficult for me to set a dollar value on that. So when I think about the opportunity cost of labor, it's a little challenging to identify that in dollar terms. However, if I turn this around and instead of thinking about the opportunity cost of labor, I think about the opportunity cost of leisure, that becomes very simple very quickly. If one is not at leisure, then we consider one to be at labor. We suppose that sleeping, eating, etc. may be some of our leisure opportunities, but really more often than not, we take sleeping out of that. That's kind of a requirement. It's not leisure. It's not labor. It's restorative to the human condition in a 24-hour cycle. So we suppose that there's 8 hours in that cycle that we're not at leisure or at labor. We're probably sleeping. Now, I know that some of us sleep more, some of us sleep less, but generally we think of this as an 8-hour cycle within any given 24 hours. So as we think about the cost of an hour of leisure, and if we're taking sleeping out of the relationship, then what's the cost of leisure? Well, it's the same amount of labor. And we know exactly what the cost of our labor is, because when we go to work each day or each week, we have an employer that's giving that to us. So the opportunity cost of leisure is equal to whatever our wage is. And that's a fairly simple thing for us to identify. I often tell people that I can tell exactly how much they make without asking them how much they make. And all I have to do is ask them one simple question. So I could ask you one simple question, and it wouldn't be what do you make? It wouldn't be what does your employer pay you? It wouldn't be what is your income. But I can ask you one simple question to identify exactly how much you get paid, and that would be, what is the cost of leisure for you? And I know that the cost of leisure for you, or the opportunity cost of leisure rather, is how much your labor is, what you charge for your labor, and that's your wage. Well, now let's think about this backwards bending labor supply curve that I referenced. This is a little unusual. We know that we have our typical labor supply relationship. We know that that's positively sloped. We perhaps talked about why that's positively sloped in a different module within this course. But we can suppose that it is positively sloped. If nothing else, we know that for individuals to choose to work, then they need to be motivated to work. And if you want me to supply more of my labor, then you likely have to pay me not only more dollars in the aggregate, but you have to kind of entice me by paying me more dollars per unit of labor. Well, that makes sense to us. I think that's somewhat intuitive. But there's another situation with the labor supply curve where we have a backwards bending relationship that might present itself that may be similarly intuitive but looks completely different than this. So let's think about the relationship here. We, of course, have wage and labor. We start at 0, and let's assume that there is some reservation amount here. Well, let's also assume that in this case, there's a budget for this individual, let's say, that we're dealing with, that would require them to need $400 a day. So we're going to be talking about a daily labor supply. So at $400 a day, well, I can get that at 20 hours of labor and at $20, just exactly as we have noted here. So I would say that as we move towards this, the labor supply curve is upward sloping. But what happens once we've reached that $1 a day limit that we have? What is necessary then for the labor supply curve to look like if, having reached that, causes us to decline in our motivation to work? Well, if that's the case, we're going to see that this will sharply turn northward, because what that's really saying is when it becomes steeper, that we need to be motivated yet more by dollars per hour to get us to work fewer number of hours or a small number of additional hours. So here we see that a relatively limited number of hours difference brings about a pretty good difference in the wage. And obviously I've got my lines a little bit skew here so you can't see it as effectively, but as this line becomes steeper, then we are requiring more dollars for every additional hour. And as we then go beyond our need, this line becomes very steep because perhaps I value leisure sufficiently to say that no, regardless of how many dollars you're paying me, I'm not going to work more hours. And we might even see that this curve becomes backwards bending, so it starts to turn back in on itself, which is simply saying that as the worker receives yet more wage, perhaps the worker is motivated to work fewer hours. This would suggest that the worker has a fixed budget requirement, a fixed dollar per day, in this case, requirement. And once we've met that, then the labor supply curve for the individual begins to turn very steep, and then it actually starts to bend back on itself. So this is a backwards bending labor supply curve. And it's an interesting relationship. We don't often think about this. In fact, we're not sure that we see this same curve within most other inputs to production or most other goods of any kind. Let's now talk about the presence of stabilizers in the marketplace and how they affect the labor supply relationship. So by stabilizers, we're talking about different compensations or incomes that one can gather without necessarily having to go out and exchange them for labor. So we know that unemployment insurance, which is something that we get when we are unemployed under certain conditions, and we don't get if we're working. So this is a stabilizer. It's some non-labor form of compensation. Workman's compensation, similar. When one has been injured on the job and can't work for a period of time or can work a reduced number of hours, they receive this compensation. Disability income is similar. We have to think about the earned income tax credit. And if you don't know what the earned income tax credit is, it is a credit that is applied to one's tax liability with the federal government when one fills out their tax forms, files their income tax return, and it actually, as a credit, is cash money to them. And if they have more credits because of this credit and, let's say, withholding taxes, which become credits towards that tax liability as well, if the credits are greater than the amount owed to the federal government, then that money is returned to the taxpayer in the terms of a tax refund. So that's income that one might get in a year's period, not every day, every week, every month, but in a yearly period. That is a non-labor income. So these are what we think of as being automatic stabilizers. These kick into the marketplace when certain economic conditions or physical conditions exist, and they are largely incomes brought to the household by non-labor activity, but funded by some state-oriented policy. We think a little bit differently about some other stabilizers, which maybe are not automatic stabilizers, but nonetheless will stabilize wages or incomes in an economy in the event of certain economic activities, and they will stabilize labor supplies as well. Think about this: military enlistment. When the economy is very challenging and younger people cannot find the kind of jobs they want, then we find typically that military enlistment amongst that age group rises. Whereas when the job market is very strong and the economy is very strong, we find that military enlistments fall, unless there is some kind of activity taking place around us that increases patriotism, or unless we see that the opportunities within the military for advancement, for income, for opportunity, for travel, perhaps, those will actually, changes there will also change this. But largely those remain somewhat fixed, and so we see that when the opportunities in the market for workers are limited, then military enlistment increases. The same thing is true for enrollment in higher education. We see that when the opportunity cost of working, or when the opportunity cost of education is high, which would mean that the labor costs are high, earnings opportunities are high, we see the opportunity cost of higher education is high, then we see higher education enrollments decline. When the opportunity cost of higher education is low, which means incomes are low, wages are low, maybe we're in a recession, maybe unemployment is high, then we see that higher education enrollments increase. We similarly see this for retirement as well. We see that individuals, as they reach the later years of their working lifespan, when they become older, if they have some resources built up behind them that allow them to step out of the labor market and just exist on those resources, that they will leave the labor market. But that's if opportunities for labor income, wage income, are low. But if opportunities for wage income are high, then we find that those individuals will stay in the market, so increasing the labor force or maintaining the labor force. And we can say the same thing about other household endowments. And a household endowment might be a trust fund that one received. It might be support from some other earnings opportunity that they had. Let's say it's having won the lottery. They have some stock dividends. They receive rents on some properties they've accumulated over the years. These are all endowments, financial endowments of the household that allow income to flow into the household without the individual receiving the income to have to perform labor.